A major U.S. military unit is on alert for deployment to American soil. This is not a drill. About 1,500 active duty Army paratroopers from the 11th Airborne Division in Alaska have been put on standby for a potential mission to Minnesota. Why? What domestic crisis could require the alert of an elite Arctic warfare division thousands of miles away? Some see this as a necessary precaution by the Trump administration. Others see it as a dangerous and unprecedented militarization of domestic affairs. Who's right? And what does this signal about the state of America in 2026? To understand why this alert is so explosive, we need context. The deployment of active duty U.S. military personnel inside the country for civil unrest is governed by the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. This law strictly limits the federal government's use of the military for law enforcement. There are exceptions, primarily under the Insurrection Act, which allows a president to deploy troops to suppress insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy. Historically, its use has been rare and controversial. President Eisenhower used it to integrate schools in Little Rock. Presidents Kennedy and Johnson used it during the Civil Rights era. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush federalized the National Guard during the Los Angeles riots. The last major controversy was in 2020, when then President Trump threatened to use the act during nationwide protests, a move that drew significant criticism from military leaders and legal scholars. Now, in 2026, we have a new alert. The 11th Airborne Division, based at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, Alaska, is a unique force. They are America's premier Arctic warriors, trained for extreme cold weather combat and rapid deployment. Putting them on alert for Minnesota is a significant logistical and symbolic move. Minnesota itself has a recent history of severe civil unrest, most notably following the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020, which sparked global protests. The state has also been a flashpoint for political and social tensions in the years since. The central tension here is clear: the balance between federal authority and state sovereignty, and the line between maintaining order and militarizing a domestic crisis. The Trump administration, now in its second year, has signaled a more assertive approach to domestic security. This alert raises the immediate question: what intelligence or threat assessment has prompted this specific, dramatic step? Supporters of this military alert argue it is a responsible and prudent measure by the Trump administration. They point to a volatile and increasingly unpredictable domestic threat environment. Proponents argue that state and local authorities in certain jurisdictions have repeatedly proven unable or unwilling to maintain public order and protect federal property and citizens' rights. Their strongest argument hinges on preparedness. Putting a highly mobile, self-sufficient unit like the 11th Airborne on alert is not an order to deploy, it's a signal of readiness. In this view, it's a strategic deterrent. The mere knowledge that such a force is prepared to move could discourage bad actors from instigating large-scale violence. Proponents point out that the National Guard, while a vital tool, is a state-controlled force. If a state governor refuses to activate the Guard, or use it effectively to quell unrest that spills across state lines or targets federal interests, the president has a constitutional duty to act. They also argue that the nature of threats has evolved. They point to the potential for coordinated, violent unrest that could overwhelm local police. The specter of 2020's protracted unrest in cities like Portland, Seattle, and Minneapolis looms large in this argument. We cannot wait for cities to burn and for citizens to be terrorized before we prepare our response. A narrative from this side goes. The Trump administration, they say, is simply ensuring that if a governor fails in their duty, the federal government has the capability to step in swiftly to protect lives and property. Furthermore, supporters might link this to a broader, tougher stance on law and order, a key pillar of the current administration's platform. This alert is framed as a logical extension of that policy, demonstrating resolve and ensuring that the full weight of the federal government can be brought to bear to prevent chaos. The use of an elite unit like the 11th Airborne, they contend, underscores the seriousness with which the administration views potential threats to domestic tranquility. But wait, there's another side to this story. Critics, however, see this move as a dangerous provocation and a stark escalation in the militarization of American domestic life. Opponents counter that placing an elite combat unit on alert for a U.S. state fundamentally changes the relationship between the citizen and the government. Their strongest argument is one of principle and precedent. The Posse Comitatus Act exists for a reason, to prevent the federal government from using the standing army as a police force against its own people. Putting paratroopers, soldiers trained for airborne assault against foreign enemies, on standby for Minnesota shatters a long-held norm. Critics argue this blurs a sacred line, making the use of active duty troops for crowd control or law enforcement seem routine rather than an absolute last resort. Skeptics point out the chilling effect. The alert itself, even without boots on the ground, could be seen as an intimidation tactic against legitimate protest and dissent. It sends a message, they argue, that the federal government views certain populations or political activities through a lens of potential insurrection. This could deter peaceful assembly and free speech, core First Amendment rights, out of fear of a military response. Furthermore, opponents question the necessity and the intelligence behind it. Is there a specific, credible threat to justify this? Or is this a political maneuver, a show of force to rally a political base around themes of law and order and liberal city chaos? They point to the choice of unit, the 11th Airborne from Alaska. Its deployment would be a massive, visible operation. Critics ask if this is less about practical readiness and more about theatrical demonstration of power. Military experts on this side also raise practical concerns. U.S. troops are not trained in domestic policing, crowd control, or nuanced community engagement. Their rules of engagement are for war zones. Inserting them into a complex, tense domestic situation risks tragic miscalculation, escalation of violence, and a profound erosion of public trust. The image of American soldiers confronting American citizens on Main Street is, for this side, a nightmare scenario that this alert makes tangibly closer to reality. So who's right? Let's look at the evidence and the broader landscape. Stepping back from the immediate debate, the data and recent global context paint a sobering picture of why such an alert might be contemplated, regardless of one's position on it. First, look at the international climate. Our other sources today reveal a world under strain. Source 4 notes Israel's Mossad chief is in the U.S. for talks on Iran with a White House envoy, indicating ongoing high-stakes geopolitical tensions that demand military readiness. Source 5 from The Guardian delivers a stark economic fact: a quarter of developing countries are poorer now than before the COVID-19 pandemic, with sub-Saharan Africa particularly affected. This global economic distress is a known catalyst for social instability and migration pressures worldwide, factors that can indirectly fuel domestic tensions within nations like the U.S. Second, examine the domestic pattern. The Trump administration has consistently pursued an America First policy with a strong emphasis on border security and a robust executive branch. The legal framework of the Insurrection Act grants the president broad discretion. The evidence of recent history, the sustained unrest of 2020, provides a ready-made justification for any administration to argue for enhanced preparedness. However, experts in constitutional law note the lack of transparent thresholds. There is no public, detailed rubric for what triggers such a military alert. The evidence available to the public is often anecdotal or classified. This creates a vacuum filled by political narrative. Neutral security analysts note that while contingency planning is standard, the public announcement or leak of such an alert is itself a political and psychological event. Furthermore, data on civil unrest shows that the presence of federalized forces, while sometimes quelling violence in the short term, often correlates with longer-term deepening of community grievances and erosion of local legitimacy. The evidence from past deployments suggests that solving the root causes of unrest, economic disparity, racial injustice, political polarization, is not achieved through military readiness, but through political and social dialogue, something our source on Kenya painfully illustrates is often in short supply. The reality is more complex than either side fully admits. The truth likely lies in an uncomfortable middle ground. On one hand, the critics have a powerful, principled point. The normalization of military alerts for domestic deployment is a profound shift with deep historical and constitutional ramifications. The potential for misuse or escalation is real and terrifying. The symbolism is damaging to the fabric of civil-military relations. On the other hand, the proponents are not entirely inventing a threat landscape. The United States is deeply polarized. The capacity for rapid, large-scale civil disturbance exists. A president of any party does have a duty to ensure the continuity of government and public safety. What most people miss is that this alert is as much about messaging as it is about military logistics. It is a signal to multiple audiences, to potential agitators, to political opponents, to state governors, and to the administration's own supporters. It communicates resolve, a willingness to use all levers of power, and a particular view of where the nation stands in 2026. The uncomfortable truth is that this move is both a practical contingency plan and a potent political symbol, and it is impossible to fully separate the two. The greatest risk may not be the deployment itself, but the way this alert further entrenches a national psyche where fellow citizens are increasingly viewed through a lens of potential conflict, requiring a military solution. For ordinary people in Minnesota and across America, this alert injects a new layer of anxiety into an already tense political climate. Business owners may worry about the impact on commerce and safety. Activists planning peaceful protests may now have to calculate the remote but heightened risk of a federal military response. Residents may feel either more secure or more surveilled and threatened, depending entirely on their political viewpoint and community. What to watch for next is crucial. First, any official statement from the Pentagon or the Trump administration clarifying the intelligence behind this alert. Second, the reaction from Minnesota's state government and governor. Will they welcome the federal preparedness or condemn it as an overreach? Third, watch for movements of equipment or support personnel, which often precede actual troop deployments. The future this points to is one where the threshold for involving the military in domestic affairs may be permanently lowered. The precedent set now will inform the decisions of future presidents. The coming days will reveal whether this alert was a temporary precaution or the first step in a new, more militarized chapter of American domestic life. So, we're left with the central debate: prudent preparedness or dangerous escalation, the protection of order or the undermining of liberty. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Are you on team prudent precaution or team dangerous escalation? Drop a comment below. Write 1 if you support the administration's alert as necessary, or 2 if you believe it's a step too far. Share this analysis with someone who needs to see both sides of this critical story. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today for more breaking news and deep dive analysis on the stories shaping our world.